All right, we are recording in progress. And I forget what number this is. It's probably getting up to 6 or 7 of our sessions on just this by Richard Rohr. And just like we were talking about, we're going to take a step back today since we had a week off. It's been a couple of weeks since we met. We're going to step back and we're going to read this section because I think we have just 2 paragraphs left in the section, but I want to go back and get a running start from the beginning. So we'll start at page 15. But just as we always do, before we go into the text, anything that you've been processing over the last couple of weeks that you want to bring up, any questions, any concerns, rebuttals, what you got going? All right, we're doing well then. So we're still in the introduction, believe it or not. And Richard opened this up with his discussion on awe and surrender. And basically, we're talking about contemplative practice. We're talking about a contemplative lifestyle. And so if we are not able to allow our moments to awe us, if we're not able to allow our moments to surprise us, to shock us, to be present enough to be surprised and shocked, then obviously we're not living a contemplative lifestyle. It's really all about being so present that the smallest thing can speak to us in very significant ways. And if we're going to be able to do that, in the next section, he talked about the log removal process, which means that we have to be able to get rid of all the things that are blocking our vision, all the things that would keep us distracted from, blocked from being able to see what is right in front of us, see what's in that moment. This third section is about seeking dispassion. And he defines dispassion as the inner peace and contentment that comes when we finally hit this emotional regulation that we've talked about. When we're finally able to hit a place of equilibrium, a place of balance. And so we're not being dragged along by emotions and triggers and errant thoughts and all of that sort of thing. So dispassion was right at the center of the early Christians' virtue list, along with unoffendability that we like to talk about, right? But if you think about it, undefendability is just another way of saying, dispassion, right? If you're not going to get triggered, if you're not going to get offended, it's because you've found this place of this balance. And so things aren't going to rock your world the way that they used to. So what I want to do is let's start right on page 15, seeking dispassion. And we're just going to read the next 3 pages. And then we'll stop and we'll really discuss the last 2 paragraphs. But just so that we can get a run at this, because it's been a bit. The desert fathers and mothers who emerged in the early centuries after Jesus, despite their seeming primitiveness and asceticism, often demonstrated an amazing awareness of the connection between the one seeing, the person seeing, and what is seen. And in this regard, they're almost Zen Buddhist in their simplicity, stories, and insight. The Syrian deacon of Agrius Ponticus, who is sometimes called the grandfather of what became the Enneagram, says in the Philokalia that when the passions are aroused in the non-rational part of our nature, they do not allow the intellect to function properly. He and many others make this insight foundational to their understanding of the science of prayer. And just to remember, the Philokalia is a collection of texts that date from like the 4th century through the 15th century. And it's the foundation of contemplative thought and practice in the Eastern Orthodox Church. So that's what he's talking about when he's saying the Philokalia there. This is an interesting quote because it can be a bit misleading. When the passions are aroused in the non-rational part of our nature, they do not allow the intellect to function properly. Now he's going to hit this later, but he doesn't really connect the dots as much as I would have liked, because this sort of implies that the prayer needs to be non-emotional, but it does need to be intellectual or rational. And that's not where we're going with this. What we're talking about is that both the emotional and the intellectual or rational are equally distracting and equally blocking of the pure presence that is the goal of contemplative prayer or contemplative practice. So yes, they were trying to get themselves to a place of emotional regulation where they weren't getting triggered to great emotional stress. And yes, your intellectual and rational faculties don't work very well in that state. But that's not what we're trying to get in terms of prayer. We're not trying to move the needle over to the intellectual side. Now, I think he's going to make that clear in the next couple of paragraphs, but I just wanted to connect those dots as we're going along. So continuing on, the seeking of dispassion for ancient solitary monastics referred to the inner peace and contentment that they discovered through their profound experience of what they often called prayer of quiet, building on Jesus' talk of going to your inner room and not babbling on like the pagans do. In this early period, prayer did not refer to some kind of problem-solving transaction between humans and God, nor was it about saying words to God, but was quite literally putting on a different thinking cap, as the nuns used to say to us. It seems that it was not thinking at all, as we now understand it, because such thinking is too often just reacting to or writing repetitive commentaries on the moment. So now you can see where he's saying, yeah, this prayer that we're talking about, this way of experiencing life that we're talking about, is not just running it through the intellectual or rational prism. It's not just about reducing everything to words and babbling on like the pagans do. So we're going to be trying to step aside from both of those poles of human experience, right? Both the emotional and the intellectual, so that we can get to this place of pure presence, really, that we're talking about. For these desert mothers and fathers, prayer was understood not as a transaction that somehow pleased God, the functionalistic and problem-solving understanding of prayer that emerged much later, but as a transformation of the consciousness of the one who was doing the praying. The awakening of an inner dialogue that from God's side had never stopped. That is why the Apostle Paul could speak so often of praying always. In simple words, prayer is not changing God's mind about us or anything else, but allowing God to change our mind about the reality right in front of us, which we are usually avoiding or distorting. Leave your offering there before the altar. Go first and be reconciled to your neighbor, and then come back and offer your gift, Jesus says. Brilliant. Too many of us try to do an end run for a godly prayer while still carrying a reservoir of stagnant water within us. Nothing new or good can happen in that old swamp. Dispassion was a desert mother's and father's notion of freedom and salvation, long before we devolved into the much later notion of salvation as being transported to another universe. For many, God is seen and used as a partner in our private evacuation plan, more than any love encounter that transforms mind or liberates heart. Such solipsism is revealed in the little, if any, concern that many Christians show for justice, the earth, or the poor. The fruits of love are often not apparent in them, and not even of much interest to many of them. Thus, our true God became missing in action from creation and most human concerns. And just to back up a little bit, we talked about solipsism. It's not a familiar word to many of us, but it means a perception that is centered in self. Or moving further into philosophy, it is the belief that the self is the only thing that can truly be known. So if you are coming from a perspective that has you at the center, that would be solipsism. So to read that sentence again, such self-centeredness is revealed in the little, if any, concern that many Christians show for justice, the earth, or the poor. Okay, makes sense? The fruits of love are often not apparent in them, and not even of much interest to many of them. Thus, our true God became missing in action from creation and most human concerns. In my opinion, such a notion of salvation is at the root of much contemporary atheism, agnosticism, abandonment of organized religion, and mental illness itself. We imprisoned God in churches, in ceremonies, and in small fear-based people. So he's making a huge statement here that the original idea of salvation was very different than it is today. And we talked about this last time, that to the ancient Jews, and the rabbis said this outright, any prayer that was not prayed in the name of all of Israel was no prayer at all. And so the pronoun that would always be used in prayer was a plural pronoun. It was always we and us. It was never me and I, because a prayer had to be prayed in the collective. They were a collective society. And so the prayer had to be for the common good, or it was no prayer at all. So salvation was understood by the ancient Jews as spiritual liberation, not just for the individual, but for the group, for the family, for the clan, for the nation, but also right here and right now, not sometime after we die, not sometime in the Olam Haba, the world to come. It's such a very different view of what salvation is all about. And we're going to get into that a little deeper in the next few paragraphs. I now believe that the other universe we are rightly seeking is not elsewhere or in the future, but right in our own hearts and heads. If we put on an entirely different mind, then heaven takes care of itself, and in fact, begins now. So it is nothing we have to believe in for later. The early monks and later friars discovered that if we resorted too exclusively to wordy prayer, verbal recitations, and social theatrical liturgies, we would remain stuck inside of our own minds and hearts. The one doing the seeing, spinning the prayer wheels, and performing the worship has not changed, and thus sees or hears or offers nothing new to the world. So this next paragraph is something that we haven't read yet. I just wanted to go back to this last one. How are you feeling about this, both this idea of salvation as being spiritual liberation here and now? You could, I suppose, call it spiritual awakening, connection, presence here and now, the ability to be shocked by your moments here and now, and realize that the world is so much deeper, there's so much more involved in it than is usually seen at the surface of things, and not the admittance to heaven and the avoidance of hell sometime later on in life, as decided by someone outside of yourself. So the way he puts it here, I now believe that the other universe we are rightly seeking is not elsewhere or in the future, but right in our own hearts and heads. And if we put on an entirely different mind, then heaven takes care of itself and in fact begins now. So it's nothing we have to believe in for later. Is that baking anyone's noodle?
Isn't that being present? Isn't this all about, takes me back to Brother Lawrence and being happy with the now and being present with the now instead? Because if I am focused on salvation later, I'm not being present, and then I'm on that hamster wheel of performance to get to the next thing, to get to the next happy moment, instead of just being where I am right now.
I think it's probably more than that, Lori, but being present is the experience of it. Let's put it that way. But what we're really talking about in freedom, Jesus says the same thing. He says, if you will live the way I live and love the way I love and follow this way of life that I'm practicing, then you will know the truth. And remember, know in Hebrew, yada, is not about intellectual knowledge or learning facts. It's the intimate experience that over time allows you to actually know something the way you would know a person if you lived with them for a decade or so. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. This freedom is a freedom from fear, because that's the primary thing that we're dealing with. If we're free from fear, then we're able to be completely free to be present, to be vulnerably open, our defenses down and in the moment. And that takes this fearless freedom that Jesus is talking about. So salvation is that liberation. It's the freedom from fear that allows us to be here, to be now, to be able to let our resources flow through us without fear. We don't have to dam them up or hoard them, to love the enemy, to not be offended by those who are different. All of those things are part and parcel to this presence, this freedom, and this salvation.
Davis, it's very similar to what you talk about with kingdom, the now kingdom, now kingdom here today versus waiting to go to kingdom some other day. It's similar, but you're talking about salvation like it's releases the fear of, we are free from fear. Is that the same as being in kingdom here and now?
I think absolutely so. Maybe we could even say that kingdom is the experience of salvation.
I see it as I make my heaven here now, because this is my position too. Is I don't know if there's a heaven after I die, so I make my heaven here now. And I when I was really really convoluted, I listened to your message from 2 years ago, the portable heaven. I go, yes, I will do that. I don't wait till, I don't know, 20, 30 years from now or whatever.
The way I put it in the past is that heaven is waiting for us, but we don't have to wait for heaven. And the way that Richard Rohr puts it in this paragraph right now is if we put on an entirely different mind, then heaven takes care of itself. And in fact, begins now. So it is nothing we have to believe in for later. You know, heaven is either now or it's never. It's always now. That's the only place heaven can be experienced is now. And after we die, whatever the experience we have then, it'll be now. Everything is now. There is only one now. So it's a whole different way of looking at things.
For me, it makes me to hear that heaven is now. I think it just fills me with possibilities and more freedom of choice, and looking at every moment of my day as the possibility of being joyful and abundant for me. If I can see the goodness in any of those moments, even the difficult ones, and those are the most challenging for me. You know, but I've been trying to soak myself in the possibility that, you know, when those difficult moments come, that the God I know is with me even then, and still loves me, and has just wonderful new possibilities opening for me if I lean into it and trust him and surrender it to him, and refuse to judge myself, but try to accept my flaws or weaknesses or mistakes or what have you. But there have been more moments of freedom for me. I think as I've moved into that thinking process and feeling process, and trying to accept what is. You know, even though I still wrestle with the way I want it to be, or the way it should be, you know, or what have you, which was in your message last Sunday. And yet at the same time, I feel like I'm not alone. You know, I think we're all in that space, you know, to some extent or another. But it makes this life to me feel much more worth living, rather than just putting everything on hold and stuffing things away. and just hoping for, heaven to come at some later point. I mean, I've never been able to completely grasp the joy in that, frankly. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah. If you're waiting for something, you're not in kingdom, right? And it's important to remember, I mean, if you tell most people that heaven is now, they're really going to wonder what you're smoking, right? Because look around. I mean, just look around. Okay. But the important thing, heaven is not in the circumstances.
right.
Kingdom is not in the circumstances. Jesus said, you're not going to find kingdom by looking out there by observation, saying, oh, there it is, or here it is. The kingdom is, and the word he used in the Greek means within, among, and in the midst of all at the same time. It's one of those all-purpose prepositions. And it's very descriptive, though, because the kingdom is always going to move from the inside out, not the outside in. So it's not in the circumstances. It's not in the world, so to speak. It's in us. And we're going to bring it to whatever circumstances. Kind of like what you just said, Judy. Bad times, good times, you can still feel connected. You can still feel freedom. And what is it that you're experiencing when you say you're experiencing freedom? What is that? What does it feel like? You said it, Judy, so maybe you can tell us. When you say that you are experiencing freedom, what is it that you're actually feeling that's different?
There's an aliveness to it. I don't know. I mean, there's a sense that there's meaning in all of it, and if I can choose to look at it in the way that God is viewing it, then, how can I lose? Even if it's difficult. No, I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know.
That I think, underneath that feeling of aliveness is also going to be a growing sense of fearlessness. You're not worried about so many things.
Yeah.
You're not offended by so many things. It's just the ability to see through that stuff that is impermanent. It's all changing. And being able to just be grateful, present, hopeful in this moment right now, however it's presented. And that's what I think that freedom feels like.
I think there is I think I'm hearing there's also a moment of peace in that.
Oh,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're just, I think of a life experience that I had once. I used to have really bad anxiety, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I was at a cemetery once. It was raining, nobody else was there, and I had this real big fear of death. And I happened to kick over a card. It was like, I think Mother's Day or something. It was raining and it started to play music and I just broke down and was sobbing like a baby. And I got up and at that moment I had this peace come over me. And you could have came up to me at that point with a gun in your hand. I had no fear of dying. And if you'd have brought the gun in my head, I would have said, is everything okay? My concern was for the other, not because you couldn't hurt me. You could kill me, you could take my life, but you couldn't get rid of me, if that means anything. That inner me. You could get rid of the flesh.
Just so.
It's a moment that I wish I could retain for always, but it does come and go. But I think that's what you're describing. I think what I get out of this is heaven is now. It's just I'm not there yet. And that's what I'm praying for.
But I think
And-
it's not like, to me,
Go ahead.
my experience is like heaven is now here, but I don't experience this 24/7, but I have little snippets of it, right?
Right.
Like spending time with my daughter for lunch, or we played this game. That's pieces of heaven. The lunch I had, Judy next to me and John Hartman, and that's pieces of heaven.
And it gives us that little taste, though, gives us a taste for more
Right.
pieces
Yeah.
of heaven.
And I think the way it works is it starts out with these little snippets like Ellen was talking about, or you too, Tony, that are heavenly. You know, she's with her daughters. Okay, so that's an ideal circumstance for a mother. I remember when Ellen was going up north and she was, just taking a road trip by herself. And so she had time to just stop whenever she saw a beautiful vista or whatever, and hummingbirds and everything were speaking to her. So those are really ideal moments that you now are aware enough of and present enough to actually experience as heavenly. But I think as we progress in this, we need less and less heavenly circumstances to still experience heaven, in the sense of just the mundane, the daily. I mean, if you can experience heaven at work, now you're really getting someplace. And then, like Judy says, if you can experience it in a very difficult moment, a painful moment, then obviously we turn the corner. But we're always going to be oscillating. Don't think that you're ever going to be able to flip a switch and it's 100% heaven. It doesn't work that way. We're human. So we're always going to be oscillating. But I think as we get further forward, we cross that magic 51% mark we're always talking about. Now you are characterized by kingdom, characterized by living in this space. And then you will notice that the oscillations start to compress and the highs and lows aren't quite as deep. And the triggers are further and fewer between. And so that does take place over time.
Does the
But
word,
go ahead, Tom.
does the word stoic, like in my mind, when my crazy weirdness, anxiety show up, I like to retreat to the stoic and ask myself questions, to calm the wind in the storm. And it helps me, right? Because those emotions can sometimes get a hold of me.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's like that moment where I'll say, okay, wait a minute. It's like, what are you really afraid of? And it's almost like I'm reading in this that you're going to still have emotions. You don't want that to go away, but it should be more of a reaction to the intellect and the experience, like Judy was explaining, right? You kind of comes after that washing and that peace and of those emotions come through, because the other emotions can make you make some poor choices. If that makes any sense.
It does. And maybe the only thing that we want to have as a bit of a caveat there is that sometimes stoicism, or being a stoic to us colloquially these days, means kind of grinning and bearing it. And we don't want to think that that's what we're doing. We're not just stuffing it. We're not just trying to get through it, but we're actually finding that place of dispassion, right? That place where we're letting go of all that stuff. We're not clinging to the way things should be so hard that we can't enjoy the way that they are. And that's a big difference. But yes, the Stoic does apply in the classical sense of what that word means.
So
I,
oh, excuse me, Tony, go ahead.
no, I was just thinking, if we're seeking dispassion, right, and we're looking at the desert fathers and mothers, they went to the desert so that they could learn to be dispassionate. Where us, living day to day in our society, in our cities, and our politics and everything, the challenge seems to be a lot greater for us. And that where, if I moved out to the desert all by myself, it would be a lot different for me. I might have more opportunities to connect, like we're talking about connecting with God. But somehow, for me anyway, for me, I try to go about life as it happens, okay? And sometimes I'm like on a one of those pinball games, right? There's times where, man, I'm doing okay and I'm batting here and I'm batting there and it's a flow. And then there's times, man, I hit the carom and I, fall and lose my ball or lose my balance. And I guess what I was trying to say is this: I see my interactions with other people here on a daily basis. I try to make every one of those a connection that's meaningful for me and hopefully for them. All right. And yeah, it's not a place that I think I can be at all times, but I don't know if I need to be. If I was a monk, a practicing monk or a practicing Buddhist or something like that, I'm spending my whole day in that contemplation, but I'm not being affected by daily life as much. So if I try to live my life without thinking about having dispassion, when it's happening, maybe I don't know it, but I really know when it's not happening. And that's the time where I need to stop. And then I have to take a look at, myself, how I'm being affected by the environment, and what is it that I can do to transform or move from that place to a place back to where I'm living just life. I'm not thinking about it. I'm just living. And then when I come up against something, a bump, it's a bump. It's just a bump. And for me, I feel like I really stopped thinking a lot about that. It's like, all right, I'm integrating these things, and I think when I'm not thinking about it, I'm doing it. And as soon as I move from that place, then I'm not there. And that's not, and that I don't think it's a practice. I think it's a practice, but I think it's a lot of the letting go of all those things that don't allow us to just be, right? And we talk about a recognition of that, and I think that that's really good. But the examples of like the desert fathers and mothers, I understand what they're saying, but it's not realistic to our daily life in our society right now, or there's reference to Zen Buddhism. I did Zen a long time ago, and most of my time was spent, in a place of doing zazen or meditation, but that kept me out of connection with our daily life. And so I'm trying to look at as I learn and as I learn to integrate, the less I have to think about it, the more I can just be. And sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's not okay, and I'm going to be knocked off. Like today, for example, a car almost ran into me. It upset me. I lost my balance. Before that happened, I was very tranquil, but it took me, a couple of minutes to say, hey, okay, he didn't hit me. I didn't like what happened, but he didn't hit me. So I could let it, I could just let it go. But so
Let's try to clear up a couple of things that Tony's raising, because I think they're important. First of all, yes, the desert fathers and mothers did physically go out into the wilderness, into the desert, to build their communities. They did that to get away from the way the church was changing in the Eastern, especially Eastern Roman Empire, and their inability to be able to live the kind of spiritual life they wanted to within that church. And so they needed to go outside of the villages and towns in order to be able to build communities that they felt were more in line, or they were trying to find how they could be more in line. But anywhere you go, it's a mixed bag. And I think that's the most important thing. To think that it's going to be easier if you go out into the desert, it'll be easier in some ways because you'll have less distractions, but it's going to be a heck of a lot more difficult in other ways. And so wherever you go, it's going to help in some ways and it's going to detract in other ways. And there's always going to be that equal opportunity wherever we are, whether we stay home in our day-to-day lives or whether we go out on retreat or do whatever, to be able to find this contemplative space. And the way that Tony's talking about contemplative space is contemplative space. When you're not thinking anymore and you are just in it, that's contemplative practice. That's what we're trying to do. And I do not see how the Desert Fathers and Mothers are not relevant to us. Vastly different circumstances, vastly different time and culture, of course, and we need to correct for that. But when you read the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, they are so practical. They're just about planting their tomatoes. They're not getting into any, lofty theological this or that. And they're still living in community, even though their communities are out of the way. And so I think they are relevant to us, but we do, of course, need to correct for the culture, the time, and the details of our own lives. But we're trying to do exactly the same thing as they are doing, as the Zen Buddhists would be doing, as Jesus was doing. It's the same thing. It's just going to look different in detail. But deeply interiorly, it should feel the same as well.
Mm-hmm. I think when you asked Judy the question about what are you free from, my thought was we're free from our past programming, essentially.
Good point. Good point. Yeah.
I think that thought connects with what everybody else just said. So when we're not responding to our past programming, then we can respond dispassionately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really good, William. Yes, you really nailed it for me.
But I
it's
think
my,
that's
all of the obsessive patterns that I have, or what have you. Most of us have whatever,
Yeah, I was cheating. I was just looking at the subtitles of the last couple of sections, right? And then speaking this
man.
Right?
Teacher's pet. Gosh.
And you sounded so brilliant.
But another thought I was having about Tony's reflection on the Desert Fathers is I believe the Enneagram work started with the Desert Fathers. Right. And it was something about them going out into the desert and getting away from all of the distractions of society, where you can see raw personalities kind of bubbling up and seeing these patterns that emerge just in normal human, in interactions and so on. And I was wondering if this Pontificus guy, was that period of time the same period of time where the Desert Fathers would have roamed the earth? Is he?
Yes. Yeah.
He's one of the Desert Fathers, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And the word pontificate, does that come from Pontificus?
Actually, his name is Ponticus, Evagrius Ponticus.
Okay, Ponticus. Okay, I was reading that wrong. Okay. But yeah, I mean, if we think of the Desert Fathers' influence in terms of identifying our Enneagram types, right? Like that is absolutely totally relevant today.
Which was all about what we talked about last time with the emotions, getting a hold of not letting your emotions take over the root, what is it? What do you call it? The monkey, the lizard brain taking over your reactions. So you can
the passions
step back and
overriding your
breathe.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And returning to presence, right, is, I think, I forgot who said it, but this idea of you return home to yourself, right, is returning to presence. It's returning, it's shaking off that programming and just being in the here and now. And that might mean I'm emotionally disturbed and anxious, right? Not necessarily stoic, but I'm present to whatever is happening in the here and now without being controlled, if you will, by my past programming.
I think too, like when we're living in the present, and not like a linear time at all, we have the free will of choice to create our reality, and that's where we find that kingdom too. So, and then I'm, being able to see to view things as a witness rather than, seeing them through our distorted eyes.
Mhm.
We can, in that presence, create, I don't know if I want to say create, or it's more like maybe it's more of an awareness or enlightenment of, being able to see the truth more as it is, rather than through the rose-colored glasses that we often find ourselves when we're living in the past, in that past programming.
You know, as much as I like the X-Files, Fox Mulder was wrong. The truth is not out there. You're looking in the wrong direction if you're looking out there. You know,
That's why it
The
was
whole-
such a mess.
Well, and when we talked before about kingdom and salvation and kingdom, I mean, let's raise the bar like 100,000 times. And I think of people that like Viktor Frankl, who was in a Holocaust situation, or people who are enslaved and owned by other people and have no control over their lives per se, or those kind of war victims or whatnot. I mean, they can still maybe find God moments somehow in their circumstances. I guess if it's coming from outside, from inside to out, it's got to be difficult. I mean, we always used to read things about how the slaves would sing and they pray, and to them, I think heaven was out there in a sense, but maybe it was really within them all the time. I will be in heaven. I will be out of these circumstances. Someday I'll be in that other place that I want to go to. But in some senses, it's kind of within them at the same time.
Yeah.
Find those little pieces of God in their daily doings of whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah.
And it has to be amazing. I mean, we won't know until we would ever experience something like that, how that happens.
And I would think it would have to be both, right? I mean, if we're in the midst of suffering, our praying has to include some relief from that suffering, at least, right? So there's some future oriented piece to this prayer thing, right? And I don't pray often in terms of asking for things, but I can logically see prayer like having that piece to it, right? So
Yeah.
I think that also goes back to what Tony was talking about, where he's praying when he's not thinking about it anymore. He's just in the flow, in the doing. And that's the prayer. That's the pray always of Paul, right? It's not a constant stream of thought or words. It's just an awareness of the presence as you're present to it. And I think that becomes the prayer.
Well, can you explain in the sentence where it talks about, prayer of quiet, building on Jesus is talking about going to your inner room. And then he says, and not babbling on like pagan. Is that just poking at the pagans? I mean, and then it says,
no.
I don't know Matthew, 6 through 8. Can you tell me what that is? Or what does that say?
Matthew 6, 6 through 8 is Jesus teaching the disciples how to pray, And remember, this is Matthew 6. This is right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus spent all of Matthew 5 redefining the law. Now he's redefining righteousness. And the Jews understood righteousness and measured righteousness by almsgiving, charitable giving, prayer, and fasting. Those are the three ways that they measured their own righteousness. And so they had all of these highfalutin ways of being able to do that in front of people so that everybody knew how righteous they were. And Jesus is deconstructing all of that. And he does it with fasting, he does it with almsgiving, and then he does it with prayer. And he says, when you pray, don't go out to the street corners and into the marketplace the way the Pharisees do, and elongate the tassels on their robes and enlarge the phylacteries so everybody sees how righteous they are according to their own lights. And he says, and don't use a whole bunch of words like the pagans do, the non-Jews who had these long, hours and hours of supplication and prayers to their deities. He says, when you pray, just go quietly into your closet, go quietly into your inner space. And that means both physically and spiritually into your inner space, because, hey, your Father already knows what you need before you ask him. You don't need a single word. And so this is a prayer, as the ancients would call it, hesychastic in Greek, which just means rest, quiet, peace. And so it is a silent and wordless just sense of being, rather than anything formal, ritualistic, or word-based or rational-based at all. So he's trying to get them to see the distinction between that and start to develop a life of prayer that is not just rooted in certain times of prayer and certain times for the ritual, but is just a seamless consciousness and awareness.
I think this is a little unsettling for me, but let me add to that, because this I think speaks a lot to your sermon on Sunday about, what's going on in our world and how that affects us. Because this is like what I got out of that sermon on Sunday was speaks more of this is how you deal with that. The unsettling for me is what's going on in my world. If I turn around and look back, like I feel like I'm on an island as I move towards learning more about what God's really like, which is more me just listening to that. But then if I turn around and I look back, it's unsettling for me, what's happening in our world. But like there seems to need to be like some sort of balance between, and I'm gonna use this word, being like so heavenly minded that I'm like no earthly good. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to, and yet I want to say this, and when David prayed, well, actually we talked about, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and I'm right, I will fear no evil. And I once heard somebody explain, like, would you rather get hit by the bus or the shadow of the bus? Right? Definitely you'd want to get hit by the shadow. And I think a lot of that, what's going on behind me is the shadow. But and the other part, I don't want to like leave that behind or lose the awareness of what's going on behind me. It's like I want to share with them what I'm learning, but I feel like it's a big mess. That makes sense. My 2 cents.
Well, I think, and the valley of the shadow of death, that's a poetic way of saying that you're walking through life with death looming over you, basically. It's like the sword of Damocles that's hanging over your head, right? And that's difficult. And think about it, that's human life. We're all living life with a death sentence attached. And so there's always the shadow of death. How are we to live well and richly and abundantly, as Jesus was saying that he came to show us, when we're living under a death sentence, when we're fragile, vulnerable creatures, when the world is spinning out of control, and this and that and the other is happening, But once again, what did Viktor Frankl say? Here's a Holocaust survivor, right? And he said the last of the human freedoms is the ability to choose our own attitude in any given set of circumstances. If we can do that, we're exercising the ultimate human right, our ultimate freedom as a human being. Nobody can take that from us.
Right.
No, they can take everything else from us, but they can't take our ability to choose our own attitude, the way that we see things, or choose to be convinced by them. And that's what the martyrs have shown us, throughout Christian history and throughout basically any tradition. There's always martyrs. And they're able to find a peace, a serenity, a meaning, and a purpose, even in their very difficult circumstances, to the point of their own deaths. And that's remarkable. And we all have the ability to do that to a greater or lesser extent. And that's what this is all about. It's exactly what this is all about. This is what Jesus is showing us. This is the salvation he's talking about. is that ability to find heaven even in the midst of hell. If we can do that, then we're really saved.
So I wrote a note, the question here on page 17, like the first indentation paragraph is dispassion was the desert mother's father's notion of freedom and salvation. So I wrote there, in the spectrum of dispassion, when does it become indifference or apathy?
Mm.
Because I was reading this was, I remember I was in college, I was reading Eli Wiesel about the Holocaust, where you become indifferent to the suffering of somebody else or apathetic. To me, when I read that, it's like there's a protective quality. It's so painful.
Mm-hmm.
You put it aside and you become apathetic. And then the other thing too is, for some of us who are in the healthcare, if you get burned out, there's compassion fatigue. Is that in the spectrum of dispassion?
No, two absolutely different things. I suppose you could say dispassion becomes indifference at the moment it becomes solipsistic. There's that word, solipsism. When it becomes self-centered, when the focus becomes self as opposed to the other, then it would become indifferent. But we can be dispassionate in the sense that we're not allowing our emotions to drag us around like the tail wagging the dog.
Mm-hmm.
And we are emotionally balanced, emotionally regulated, and we also can turn off the constant hamster wheel in our head of rational thought. But that doesn't make us indifferent to other people's pain and needs. We can still be very involved and very connected. That's basically the model that Jesus is showing us. Yeah, he lost his cool in the temple and overturned the money changers' tables, and he lost it with the Pharisees and in Matthew 23 and called them all broods of vipers. There was moments where his passions got away from him, but that was not his character. That was not who he was. And so we can still be cool and calm and for the most part unoffendable, but we can still deeply care about the plight of people around us and care enough to the point that we're moved to do something about it. So the two are not synonyms.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the difference is whether we are still connected and living a collective and communal life in terms of our perceptions, or if we have really gone inward that way, which is the way he was looking at salvation, right? He's saying salvation and prayer for salvation has become just a pact with God for a personal evacuation plan. That was the idea of salvation, what it's become in Western Christianity, as opposed to what it originally was all about. Does that help, Ellen?
Yes. Yeah, the difference. Like
And
it's the
Dave,
self.
I think Helen's question raises something that we touched on last time. The idea here that passion is not about high emotionality necessarily, but the passion is more like the passion of the passions on the Enneagram.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if your passion is, sloth, or your passion, like one of your driving personality characteristics is to avoid, which leads to sloth, basically. You might find yourself in that situation Ellen was describing, where you just stop caring, you just become emotionally cold. And you might not look quote unquote passionate, as in emotional on the outside, but you're still expressing your passion from the Enneagram, which is to avoid, to just not be present to the realness of the moment, whatever that might
Check
look.
out, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, you're just checked out, right?
So
It's
maybe
like
the better way to say this for Ellen and for everyone is that being dispassionate does not mean that you're not feeling, but it does mean that we have the ability to regulate our feelings. We have the ability to come back from them when we're triggered. It's not that we're not going to be triggered. We're still going to be triggered, but we're able to recover from that and come back to a grounded place so that we are not just the pawns being pulled around by our emotions, But we are realizing that they are part of us, but they are not who we are. And that's a huge distinction as well. Same thing with our thoughts. They're part of us, but they're not who we are. Who we are can't be expressed. Who we are can only be experienced in real time, which is another part of the whole difficulty with contemplation and mysticism. You know, in the last few minutes, I want to finish this last paragraph so that no one can accuse me of going backwards in this session tonight. Well, that would be awful. So on page 18, it is shocking for Catholics and Orthodox Christians to recognize that many of the early hermits and monks might have only prayed the Eucharistic prayer or chanted psalms together on very special occasions rather than daily. The daily warfare that demanded much more of them, and also does of us, is the shedding of thoughts about distractions and the constant seeking of inner quiet from our own dramas. Now, see, this to me is starting to sound like what Tony was talking about, right? He wants to see his contemplative life and his spiritual life and his prayer life be part of his daily life, not something that's out there someplace either in the desert or in the cathedral, but part of daily life. And this daily warfare that demanded much more of them and also does of us is the shedding of thoughts about distractions and the constant seeking of inner quiet from our own dramas. Again, what Tony said, when he's not thinking about it anymore, that's when he's really doing it. So I think there's a one-to-one correspondence here. A common theme found in ancient texts like the Philokalia was the inner liturgy of the heart, or the noetic liturgy of the spirit. Now, noetic is another one of those words. It means a formal or systematic practice of the liturgy of the spirit. So almost in this case, it's a little bit of a contradiction in terms, because the liturgy of the spirit is something that's not going to be rational, right? It's going to be this wordless experience, and yet we're going to have a formal or systematic way of approaching it. Really, that's what contemplation is. Contemplation is the practice by which we get to a mystical experience. Mysticism being defined as just presence to presence, just a wordless connection and knowing that is deeper than rational thought. Contemplation is the way that we get there. So that would be maybe the noetic liturgy, if you will, of the spirit. This was quite different from the later preoccupation with precise liturgical norms that in time became laws and rules which still preoccupy contemporary clergy. Those preoccupations become even more relativized when we recall that each denomination obsesses about different essential things that they each take as divine mandates. Prayer of quiet and the contemplative prayer of just this offers us no roles, rituals, scriptures, costumes, gender issues, or correct wordings about which to argue. Maybe that is exactly why it seems so ambiguous and mysterious and rare. Okay, at least we got into positive territory here tonight, so very good. And we can start right at a header next week. So that's always cool when that happens.
We're gonna have to back up a little bit.
All right, just for you, William. Okay. Hey, this was a great discussion. Once again, thank you for that. Thanks for being so open and transparent tonight. And Sarah, if we jumped you into the deep end of the pool, we're sorry, but you were holding your own there, I think, right?
Yeah.
This is really good. I love Richard Rohr's. I love it. Thank you for letting me join you guys.
Oh, you are most
yeah,
welcome.
you're welcome. Yeah,
Most welcome. Please
definitely.
come back. And Vaughn, you are most welcome too, buddy. It's good to see your face again after a too long time.
There he is.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Scotty.
Father God, thank you for being here, wherever here is. We're always somewhere, but you're always with us. It's our taking of our time to recognize your presence in the moment that allows us to have those heavenly aspirations and thoughts and rewards that we experience when we walk in what you've shown us to be the truth. Thank you for your love and your passion and your compassion and all your attention that you just lavish on us right, left, and center, and your patience with us while we sometimes don't pay attention to what you're trying to pour out on us. Thank you that you love us in such an all-consuming way that you made room for us in your plans for our future. We're thankful. We ask you to watch over and protect our loved ones, and we pray for those that are still sick and need healing and uplifting. And if we're part of that process, so be it. May we move according to your Holy Spirit in our lives. We thank you and we praise you, and we do all this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Man. All right, everybody. If you're here local,
Good
we'll
night,
see you
everybody.
Friday nights. And
Good
Sunday
night,
morning.
everybody. Yeah.
See you Friday, guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night, Sarah. Good
Bye,
night,
Kathy.
Sean.
Bye, Sarah. Bye, Jordana.
Bye, guys.
Good night, guys.
Okay. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. All right, Jordana and Linda, always the last two, the bitter enders.
Okay, I'll
Mm.
see you too on Sunday because I won't be
See
there
you
Friday.
Sunday, and Linda, I'll see you Saturday too. Okay, dear?
Okay, thank
All
you.
right.
Bye, you guys.
Good night.